Don Johnson once had it all. The kind of all that most people only see in movies. The white linen suits. The Ferrari parked outside a houseboat. The face on every magazine cover from New York to Tokyo. For a few years in the middle of the 1980s, he was not just a television star. He was the definition of cool itself. But here is what the headlines never told you. Behind that image, behind the glamour and the gold records and the powerboat trophies, something else was quietly taking shape. A fight. A secret. A fortune buried so deep inside Hollywood paperwork that even the people closest to him had stopped believing it existed. In January 2013, after years of courtrooms and appeals and legal battles that would have broken most men, Don Johnson walked away with $19 million. Not from acting. Not from music. From a deal he had signed years earlier that the studios swore meant nothing. They told him the show had lost money. They told him there was nothing left to claim. They told him to move on. He did not move on. He hired a lawyer instead. And what that lawyer found hiding inside those contracts changed everything, not just for Don Johnson, but for the family he had spent decades quietly building while the rest of the world was busy writing his obituary. That is the story most people never heard. Not the Sonny Crockett story. Not the tabloid story about a fated star running out of chances. The real story. The one that starts not in Miami, not in Hollywood, but in a place so small and so far from the spotlight that it is almost impossible to imagine it producing someone like him. Flat Creek, Missouri. A tiny community tucked into the Ozark Hills, where a boy named Donnie Wayne Johnson was born on December 15, 1949. His mother was a beautician. His father worked the land. His grandfathers stood at the front of churches and preached to their congregations every Sunday. And before he ever understood what a camera was, before he ever heard the word Hollywood, young Donnie was already standing in front of audiences, singing solos in church, feeling something stir inside him that he could not yet name. Nobody in Flat Creek was predicting stardom. Nobody was predicting much of anything. But something was already growing in that boy, something stubborn and hungry and unwilling to stay small. And that quality, more than the suits, more than the fame, more than the $19 million, is what this story is really about. The early years did not come easy. That is the part the fame tends to erase. When people look back at Don Johnson, they see the finished version. The polished star. The man who wore success like a second skin. But before any of that existed, there was a teenager in Wichita, Kansas, getting into trouble, making wrong turns, and trying to figure out what his life was supposed to become. His parents divorced when he was 12. He moved back to Missouri with his father. The stability that most kids take for granted was not something he had access to. He was arrested after stealing a car and spent time at the Lake Afton Boys Ranch, a place for young men who had run out of easier options. He later described himself without any glamour attached to those words. A skinny little runt kid trying to find a way out. That was the honest version. Not the legend. Not the icon. Just a boy from a broken situation looking for something to hold on to. What he found was a drama class. And inside the drama class, he found a stage. When he landed the lead role in his high school production of West Side Story and stood in front of a live audience for the first time, something shifted permanently inside him. The boy who had been drifting suddenly had a direction. He earned a theater scholarship to the University of Kansas, but 1 year in, the American Conservatory Theater in San Francisco came calling with a more serious opportunity. He did not hesitate. He packed up and left, because that is what people do when they finally find the thing they were built for. They run toward it. His professional debut came in 1969 in an off-Broadway production called Fortune and Men's Eyes. It was a hard and controversial prison drama that drew real attention and gave him early visibility in serious theatrical circles. From there, he pushed forward through the early 1970s. Small film roles. Television guest appearances. A co-writing credit alongside Dickie Betts of the Allman Brothers Band. He was assembling a career piece by careful piece. But the breakthrough he was working toward kept refusing to arrive. He filmed 5 separate pilots for NBC. All 5 were rejected. 5 times he got close enough to touch something real, and 5 times the door closed in his face. 2 marriages had already been annulled by this point. He was moving through his 30s without the explosion everyone around him could sense was coming. The talent was obvious. The drive was undeniable. But Hollywood does not reward talent and drive on a schedule. It rewards them on its own terms, in its own time, and only when the right combination of people and projects finally collide. For Don Johnson, that collision was coming. He just did not know it yet. The script that changed everything arrived in 1984. It was about 2 undercover vice detectives working the streets of Miami. On paper, it did not sound revolutionary. Police dramas had existed on American television for decades. But this one was different from the moment it hit the screen, and the reason it was different had everything to do with the man they cast to carry it. Don Johnson became Detective James Sonny Crockett, and almost overnight, that character stopped being a role and became a cultural phenomenon. The pastel jackets are worn over plain t-shirts. The stubble that was neither clean nor fully grown. The bare ankles above expensive shoes. The houseboat. The Ferrari. The way Crockett moved through Miami like he owned every street and every shadow in it. Miami Vice did not just attract viewers. It rewrote the visual language of American television. Fashion followed it. Music followed it. Advertisers followed it. International audiences who had never visited Florida suddenly felt like they understood exactly what Miami smelled like at 2 in the morning. And at the center of all of it stood Don Johnson, the skinny kid from Flat Creek, Missouri, who had been rejected 5 times by the same network that was now making him one of the most recognizable faces on the planet. The awards followed quickly. A Golden Globe for Best Actor in a Television Drama Series in 1986. An Emmy nomination. His image appeared on merchandise, in magazines, and in conversations happening in languages he could not speak. The fame was total, and it arrived fast, which meant the pressure that came with it arrived just as fast. Between the 2nd and 3rd seasons, Johnson made a move that required a kind of nerve most actors in his position would never have found. He stopped showing up to work. He knew what the show needed. He knew what his presence was worth. And he decided that the salary he was earning, reportedly around $30,000 per episode, did not reflect that truth. He wanted somewhere between $100,000 and $150,000 per episode. The standoff that followed was real and serious. Michael Mann pushed back hard. The studio pushed back harder. The entertainment press watched and waited for Johnson to blink. He did not blink. He held his position until a compromise was reached, somewhere around $66,000 per episode. It was not the full number he had demanded, but the principle behind the demand was more important than the difference in the figures. He had looked at the machine that needed him, calculated exactly how much that need was worth, and refused to accept less than what the math supported. That instinct, the instinct to understand ownership and value and leverage, was not going away. It was only getting sharper. And soon it would be worth a great deal more than any single salary negotiation ever could have been. Miami Vice ended in 1989. And the moment it did, a different kind of story began spreading through Hollywood. The tabloids picked it up first. Then the entertainment columns repeated it. Then enough people accepted it as fact that it stopped needing evidence to survive. The story was simple, and it was brutal. Don Johnson was finished. The style that had made him famous had aged out of the culture. The films that followed Miami Vice, Dead Bang, The Hotspot, and Harley-Davidson and the Marlboro Man did not create the seismic cultural impact people had expected from a star of his size. And so the narrative machine did what it always does when a famous person hits a quieter stretch. It took a slowdown and called it a collapse. It took a turn and called it a tragedy. It packaged a man's most private and uncertain years into a headline that was easy to sell and impossible to correct once it started moving. But here is what that narrative always left out. While the gossip columns were busy predicting his end, Don Johnson was doing something far more valuable than defending himself against rumors. He was preparing his next move with a level of strategic patience that the people writing those headlines were never capable of understanding. In 1995, a new project came together. Nash Bridges, a police procedural set in San Francisco, where Johnson would play Inspector Nash Bridges of the Special Investigations Unit. He drove a bright yellow 1971 Plymouth Barracuda. His partner was played by Cheech Marin. The show had charm and confidence and an easy rhythm that suited Johnson perfectly. But the salary, while significant at around $150,000 per episode, was not the most important part of what he negotiated. Hidden deeper inside that contract was something that very few actors in Hollywood history had ever managed to secure. A clause stating that if Nash Bridges ran beyond 66 episodes, Don Johnson would receive 50% ownership of the copyright. Not a bonus. Not a percentage of profits subject to studio accounting. Actual ownership. The show premiered on CBS on March 29, 1996, and ran for 6 seasons across 122 episodes. The threshold was crossed. The ownership clause activated. And suddenly Don Johnson was not just the face of a successful television series. He was a co-owner of it, entitled to a share of every dollar the show generated through syndication, international distribution, and long-term licensing across the more than 45 countries where it eventually aired. That was where the real fortune was always waiting. Not in the salary. Not in the fame. In the paperwork. In the clause that everyone else had overlooked and that he had been careful enough and wise enough to insist upon. Then the studio told him the show had lost $40 million. And Don Johnson picked up the phone and called his lawyer. What happened next was the part of the story that Hollywood never wanted told loudly. In 2009, Don Johnson filed a lawsuit against Risher Entertainment, along with 2929 Entertainment and Qualia Capital. His claim was straightforward. He was owed his contractually promised share of Nash Bridges' profits as a 50% copyright co-owner. The defense that came back was breathtaking in its audacity. The studio argued that Nash Bridges, a show that had run for 6 full seasons, sold to more than 45 countries, and aired 122 episodes on a major American network, had somehow lost $40 million. According to them, there was nothing to divide. No profit. No payout. Nothing owed. That argument has a long and well-documented history in Hollywood. It is called creative accounting. It is the mechanism by which studios transform successful productions into apparent financial failures on paper, protecting themselves from profit participation agreements with the writers, directors, and stars who helped build those successes in the first place. Johnson's legal team walked into that courtroom and argued that this was exactly what had happened here. The jury listened to 2 weeks of testimony. Then they deliberated for a single day. The verdict came back in Johnson's favor. $23.2 million in damages, along with formal recognition that he was and had always been a legitimate 50% copyright owner of Nash Bridges. The judge then added interest, pushing the total value of the award toward $50 million. For a moment it looked like complete and total vindication. Then the appeal arrived. In September 2012, a California appellate court upheld the core verdict but significantly reduced the final number, ruling that the interest had been calculated incorrectly and removing roughly $28 million from the award. The victory remained. The amount did not. And in January 2013, the case finally settled. Risher paid Don Johnson $19 million, and the legal battle that had consumed years of his life came to a close. His attorney framed it simply and clearly. This was never only about the money. It was about recognition. It was about confirming that the rights were real, that the work was real, and that the man who had helped build something valuable deserved to be treated as someone who had helped build something valuable. Don Johnson walked away from that settlement the same way he had walked away from every other defining moment in his life. Quietly, strategically, and with more in his hands than the people who had underestimated him ever thought he would hold. He was 63 years old. Quentin Tarantino would cast him in Django Unchained the following year. Rian Johnson would cast him in Knives Out in 2019. HBO would cast him in Watchmen. Ryan Murphy would cast him in Dr. Odyssey in 2024. The man the tabloids had buried kept working, kept building, and kept proving that the story they had written about him was never the true one. His son Jesse built his own acting career. His daughter Dakota became one of the most recognized actresses of her generation. The family that he had quietly assembled through decades of marriages and relationships and early morning drives through cities that never slept grew into something that no settlement check and no gossip column could ever fully measure. There was a fortune, yes. $19 million recovered from a studio that had counted on him giving up. A net worth that most credible estimates now place around $50 million, built from salaries and settlements and royalties and decades of understanding that ownership always matters more than applause. But the fortune that made his family cry was never only the money sitting in those accounts. It was the life behind it. The boy from Flat Creek who stole a car and found a stage and filmed 5 rejected pilots and built a dynasty anyway. That was the inheritance he left behind. Not a number. A name. And a story that kept going long after the loudest voices had already decided it was over.